A New Orleans-based federal judge who donated tens of thousands of dollars to the New Orleans Archdiocese while presiding over the Archdiocese's bankruptcy case says he will not recuse himself.
Judge Greg Guidry held a status conference this morning to explain to all of the attorneys involved why he's not stepping back from the case.
The Associated Press studied financial contributions made by federal judge Greg Guidry to the Archdiocese of New Orleans. It found Guidry gave nearly $50,000 to local Catholic charities from leftover contributions he received after serving 10 years as a Louisiana Supreme Court justice. At the same time, he served on a judicial panel overseeing the high-profile bankruptcy case of the Archdiocese of New Orleans in an appellate role.
It's inconceivable to me that this federal district judge does not know that if he makes a financial contribution to any entity, he must recuse himself from any case involving that entity, or at a minimum, disclose it to the parties and ask for them to waive the conflict.
When first presented with the AP's findings, Guidry abruptly convened attorneys on a call to say he was considering recusing himself from the case. The Archdiocese filed for bankruptcy in 2020 amid a slew of sexual abuse lawsuits. AP reporting found that Guidry began issuing rulings that altered the momentum of the bankruptcy and benefited the Archdiocese, as he was making donations to the Archdiocese. Tulane law professor emeritus Joel Friedman points out that Guidry should have followed the steps taken by other federal judges in the Eastern District.
Some of his colleagues who have connections to the Archdiocese have previously and properly recused themselves because it's a no-brainer.
But in a status conference Friday, Guidry said he received guidance from the Committee on Codes of Conduct. According to Guidry, the committee said he did not need to recuse himself because the charities he donated to aren't the actual parties before him. He also said the contributions amounted to less than 25% of the campaign funds he had to donate. Therefore, Guidry decided he's not recusing himself. Friedman argues the questions surrounding Guidry's donations will still create a host of problems.
To do this sort of thing puts every decision that he's rendered in which the Archdiocese was a party in question.
Today, Judge Guidry also said that he is certain he can be fair and impartial in this case. We reached out to the Archdiocese today, but were told no comment.